A recent article by Canadian science writer Ivan Semeniuk in the Globe and Mail began with the following phrase, "The lab coats are coming." What he was referring to, I think, was the expectation that we have in Canada, the anticipation of a greater awareness of our federal government and more respect for scientific information. I personally am concerned about the fact that a lot of potentially useful information that could reduce mental suffering is being ignored. I'm going to speak to you today about one very specific piece of it, of a larger picture of the use of nutrition to help people with mental disorders. My topic today is specifically why enhanced nutrition should be part of the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, we tend to think of PTSD mostly in the context of our military and our veterans, but there are civilian casualties, people who in natural disasters develop PTSD. Sometimes, as you can see, a fairly large segment of the population that is exposed. In addition, I am not going to go into the animal research, but we know that there are ways to take laboratory animals like rats and improve their resilience to stress, and it is with nutrition most often. In fact, laboratory animals that are given extra nutrients even recover better from traumatic brain injury. But I'm going to spend my precious few minutes today specifically talking about 3 human experiments. So here's the first one. In September 2010, the residents of Christchurch, New Zealand were hit by a massive earthquake. At the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, a scientist named Dr. Julia Ruckledge just happened to be in the midst of studying the effects of nutrient treatment on people with mental health challenges, particularly adults with ADHD and depression and anxiety. After this huge earthquake, she and her research team quickly began phoning people who were part of their studies, and they were able to locate approximately 15 people who just happened to be taking micronutrient supplements at the time of that earthquake, and another 15 people who had taken nutrient supplements prior to the earthquake, but for whatever reason they weren't taking them when the earthquake occurred. This was a perfect scenario for answering the question, does enhanced nutrition improve resilience in humans, as we already know about laboratory animals? And you can guess what they found. Participants receiving enhanced nutrition, and this was in pill form, were significantly less stressed 2 weeks after the earthquake, and it was published in the journal Psychiatry Research. You can see this on this next slide. Micronutrient in this slide, and as I'm using it today, refers to minerals and vitamins. And what you can see is, you can pay attention a little bit to the baseline because it's interesting that the micronutrient group, even before they started taking micronutrients, had a much higher level of depression and anxiety and stress. Then along came the earthquake, which of course was unexpected, and 1 week later, the micronutrient group had recovered better in terms of depression, anxiety, and stress than a comparison group. 2 weeks later, the group taking micronutrients had improved enormously. They had much less depression and anxiety and stress than did the comparison group. That's the first study. Now, the second one happened just 5 months later. You see, Dr. Ruckledge and her colleagues had the opportunity to replicate the results in a randomized trial because in February 2011, Christchurch was hit by another even more devastating earthquake. Now, you need to understand that in that intervening 5 months, this was a population under stress because, in fact, they were experiencing approximately 8,000 earthquakes. They're called aftershocks because they weren't at the level of 7 or 6. They were maybe in the 4s and 5s. But if you can imagine about 8,000 of them in 5 months, you can guess what kind of stress the population was under. But then this big one hit. And this destroyed much of downtown Christchurch. It killed almost 200 people, 7,000 were injured. It was a very large earthquake. Dr. Ruckledge and her colleagues used social media to invite the residents of Christchurch to help her find out if nutrients could be helpful to the population. It was a randomized trial of 3 multi-nutrient formulas. There was a B complex formula, so that's a mixture of B vitamins, no minerals. A second group received a broad-spectrum mineral and vitamin formula, but at a low dose. And a third group received the same broad-spectrum mineral vitamin formula at a higher dose. And there were about 30 per group, and as I said, they were randomized. And this is what they found. First of all three treatment groups, people taking any kind of nutrient treatment, showed improvements from baseline that were greater than changes in the controls who took no nutrients. And secondly, the groups taking the broad-spectrum formula improved more than B-complex on some measures, but the people taking B-complex also did rather well. But what's particularly interesting about this second study is that they included a measure of probable PTSD. And this is what they found. On this next graph, you can see the control group. This is a measure of probable PTSD, going from blue, which is baseline, to orange, which is 4 weeks later, showed no change in the level of their PTSD, and about 50% of that group met criteria for PTSD. But if you look at the three nutrient treatment groups, and that's the B-complex, broad-spectrum micronutrient low dose, and broad-spectrum micronutrient high dose, all three groups recovered in terms of their PTSD symptoms in just 4 weeks to a much greater extent. And what's especially impressive is if you put them together, what you find is that the average PTSD rate was 65% prior to the earthquake, and then just 4 weeks later on the micronutrients, it was 19%. Very importantly, these people were studied a year later. And it's an interesting question, how enduring were the effects? And as you can see here, it was very enduring. Now this is a different setup with this graph, so let me show you. As I mentioned, about 65% met PTSD criteria prior to the earthquake, those who later took micronutrients. 1 month later, they're down at 19%. 1 year later, they have continued to improve. What happened to the controls? They were at about 50% basically at baseline. 1 month after, they're pretty much the same. A year later, they have gotten better because a year of peace and quiet will help anybody who has been worrying about constant earthquakes, but they did not improve as much as those who were given micronutrients. So this article published in the journal Human Psychopharmacology shows that treating acutely during that crisis period with micronutrients has a lasting, enduring effect. Now, those are the first two studies, and they were both done in New Zealand. A critical aspect of good science, though, is the ability to replicate research results in different settings, and the southern Alberta flood of June 2013 provided that opportunity. Dr. Ruckledge and I joined forces via the internet, and we carried out a randomized trial of Albertans who experienced the flood. As published in the journal Psychiatry Research, we did replicate the results from New Zealand. Now, what this is showing is that those who received the red line received B-complex, or those who received a broad-spectrum formula consistently improved across the 6 weeks. We didn't have a placebo control because that would have been very uncomfortable to have a placebo for people who were in such crisis. So what we did was we compared them to a single nutrient, which was expected to have a modest effect, and it did. It was a modest amount of vitamin D, and you can see that there was slight improvement. So what we can conclude from this is that these are very similar. Oh, by the way, this is depression, anxiety, and stress scale. What we can see is that we got very similar results to the New Zealand studies. So now we have 3 experimental studies in humans showing that humans are more resilient to stress when their nutrition is enhanced, and it even results in a dramatic decrease in PTSD symptoms. The scientific data from both animals and humans are supportive, and the potential for harm, which I won't go into here, but we've done extensive work on safety and lack of toxicity, but the potential for harm is quite remote. I think it's time to apply this knowledge. I would like to close with a personal story of the southern Alberta flood. I live on a hill in Calgary, So we had no problems with water damage. So I did what a lot of Albertans did around here, like thousands of others really. I put on my rubber boots, my gloves, my mask, and I went out to help others by shoveling mud. And while we were shoveling, wonderful volunteers came by with wagons full of sandwiches and drinks. But given my interest in nutrition, I couldn't help but notice that most of the sandwiches that I saw were lunch meat on white bread, and the drinks were sugary sodas and things like that. And so I ate the food that I had carried with me. And then I read this in a recent New Yorker. It was just in October. This is about the mass European migration, which is happening right now. And I thought it really spoke to this topic. They said when the train halted in the Macedonian capital, activists were roaming the platform with baskets of what? Water bottles, not sugary drinks, bananas, apples, that's fruit, vitamin packs, and I'm sure there were minerals in those vitamin packs, and croissants, which probably the croissant was the most important thing. But the point I want to make is that the reality is we know as a people all over the world that we are more resilient when we are better nourished. The fact is that we know it, we don't always do something about it, but what we need now is for policymakers to take action. Pay attention to the research that exists. I am familiar with most of the research on nutrition and PTSD symptoms, as well as the larger field of nutrient treatment of mental disorders, and I'd like to help move the scientific information into the population to help those in need. Here's how to reach me, and thank you for watching.